Well, I think I can start my opening remarks that are probably the least interesting part of this discussion. And because I see that we're still having people trickle in. So I would like to extend a warm welcome to Peer Review Week and to the American Physical Society sponsored panel discussion on the tension between transparency or openness and confidentiality in peer review. As you may know, the theme of this year's Peer Review Week is identity. And in considering the identity of the agents in peer review, one variable that constantly comes up is how disclosed the participants should be. And approaches run the range from one or more participants being masked. It's sometimes called blinded, but that is not a usage that is preferred these days because there are some complications with it apart from the ableist aspect of it. It also is too on-off. Masking is a little bit different. And the other approaches are to basically to either be revealing referee identities during or after the review process, publishing reports, and revealing who the editor is, and so on and so forth. So these approaches all have practical implications, but the interesting thing about contrasting openness and confidentiality is that both of them are applied in the same aim to bolster the fairness or objectivity, so to speak, of the process. And this counterintuitive situation is why this tension exists, and why I personally am not hopeful that we're going to have a clear resolution about which is preferable today, but I am hopeful we are going to have a stimulating discussion. We are going to take questions for the panelists, either if you raise your hand or if you type it into the Q&A box. I will moderate and try to keep up with the questions as they come in. And given that we have a lot of participants, but not a lot of time, please try to keep your questions concise and remember to include a question in your remarks. I would like to just introduce our panel. They are Beverly McKeown, who is from California Institute of Technology and who is the co-lead editor of Physical Review Fluids. Dan Culp, who's the current chair of COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, and Senior Director of Editorial Development for the journals at the American Chemical Society, and Rebecca Lawrence, who's the Managing Director of F1000 Research, which publishes as an open access publishing platform. So before we get started, I just want to take the temperature of the room, so to speak, and ask what people think about confidentiality versus transparency, and you should all be seeing a poll now. Seems pretty even, but no, confidentiality is pulling ahead. Let's give it a lot of time if people still want to answer, or if there are people who are keeping their counsel to the end, who knows? Oh, well, okay. Interesting. We'll revisit this later on before the end to see if the needle has moved, so to speak. Very good. But I think we can actually start with any questions that we have for the panelists at this point. And so, anyone for any questions? I can throw out a question to the panel to get things going, but just waiting a little while to see if somebody's got something. No. Okay, so I wanted to ask a question about this whole strategies of transparency and confidentiality. This anonymity and thus openness in terms of revealing identities and reports, whatever the policy might be, do they all need to be compulsory in order to be effective, for instance, in reducing bias, or can it be up to a personal choice? Anybody has any thoughts on that?
I'm happy to kick off if that would help. So I guess so just for context, so F1000 uses a compulsory, fully transparent peer review process. So named reviewers and the reports are published alongside the article. And I think the reason why we felt that it's important to be compulsory is that, you know, the reasons why you might not want, you know, if you at an individual level might not want to share who you are probably the examples where really the benefit of sharing who you are is most important. It allows you to kind of hide behind the shield in terms of what it is that you're saying about the article. And I think that's problematic. I think it's important to have that transparency, recognizing that, you know, there are some challenges around it and it's not perfect, clearly, but I think, you know, to enable everybody to be able to see potential biases, as there are potential biases, to see who the people are. Actually, I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence that suggests that it makes the peer review a lot more constructive by having the reports out there and knowing who it is who is writing the report. Give us credit for the reviewers, of course, including more junior researchers to get credit for, you know, they're often the people who actually do the review, so they can get credit for it. And it allows authors, reviewers and readers actually to see for themselves any potential biases, judge accordingly and make their own decisions.
Yeah, just to chime in, I think from the COPE perspective, you know, we do not back a particular form of peer review, but transparency and openness are definitely important priorities within the whole process of peer review. I think in the case, in answering your question, Daniel, I think it even goes beyond making it mandatory across a journal. It would be great, as tradition has it, just about everyone had sort of used the single blind, as they say, peer review, right, where the referees are always blind, and it had been a universal habit for the most part. I think if we can all move toward a transparent an open peer review system, that would be the most beneficial. I think it would offer the greatest transparency, the greatest way of communicating issues, and at the same time take away from the possibility of sort of downstream punishments. For instance, if a young reviewer contradicts something that a more established researcher has done, you know, the fear in open peer review is always that, you know, next time that young guy goes for the young person goes for a grant or something, and this highly regarded researcher is on the panel to investigate or to determine, will there be retribution? If everything was transparent and open, including grant applications to national institutions, I think it really, really levels the playing field and offers so much greater communication of ideas and what's really going on underlying the research. And it just opens the discussion.
As it happens, somebody has just written in they're anonymous, but appropriately perhaps, about how do we protect junior researchers in the case of transparency. And since there's been some, both you and Dan and Rebecca have come out sort of on the side of openness and transparency here, what do you say to this question about protecting junior researchers?
Well, I was going to come out on the other side, actually, so maybe I can jump in and say that's my concern, actually, that, you know, in an ideal world, everything is transparent and fair. But, you know, we all know that a lot of recommendations and a lot of opinion formation happens outside of those open channels. And so, you know, one could pose the question, will junior researchers feel comfortable participating in our review process if it is as fully transparent as we've been discussing? So I think these are very real problems, and unfortunately they're very real problems for the groups who would perhaps benefit from transparency on the other side of the publishing process. So from the journal side, I mean, these are things that we need to consider in depth, of course.
So you're both all mentioning the transparency for reviewers, but there's another sort of side to the coin, which is anonymous authorship. And there, I mean, I have some thoughts about whether that should be compulsory one way or the other. Either authors are revealed or authors are anonymous, but any thoughts from you, the panel, on this?
Just to go to the absolute extreme, right? There's the completely anonymous peer review, right? Or almost triple, as they say, triple blind, where everyone is essentially sort of anonymous to all the pairings. So even the authors are anonymous to the editors so that editorial bias can't come in. That's a little dangerous in the sense that if you look at current trends in research ethics, or basically publication ethics, there's a lot of broad range ethical issues that go across publishers, that go across journals, that go over time. And, you know, it's that delicate balance of trying to weigh all of those features together. If an editor spots an author or a research area, you know, a research institute, that there's a history of ethical issues, it does give them an opportunity to flag that. And if they remain anonymous, then will things like paper mills be more predominant, will be harder to identify them. And so, you know, when you go to one extreme, there's obviously a lot of pros and cons there. As for the referee and authors being anonymous to each other, but not to the editor, I think there's some advantages of going that way in a very consistent manner. I think too many times when you make it optional, there's a bias associated with who wants to hide themselves versus who doesn't. And that's why it should be fairly definitive. If you're going to do the double blind, you should go all the way probably and make it mandatory across your journal. If you make it optional, I think you will be instilling some bias.
I would agree with certainly your point about the triple blinding in terms of, you know, I mean, even with any type of blinding, there's always the issue, particularly in smaller fields, where people, you know, often can have a good guess. Sometimes they'll get it wrong. So they may not always be right, but often think they can have a good guess as to who it is anyway. So there is a question as to how much actually blinding or masking achieves that removal of the bias. But I think with the triple blinding, you know, there's also elements about not necessarily being able to see competing interests that that person might have and not being aware of them when you're assessing the manuscripts. You know, there's various elements that actually could be quite important as part of that. And, you know, one of the solutions potentially to achieving what I think triple blinding is trying to do is have it using potentially more AI tools, for example, where you haven't got the, you know, for things that are relevant, where you can do that, where you don't then have a human in the loop, but it's much more objective in the sort of checks that you're looking at. And I guess, you know, one of the things that we do, this is obviously much harder to do on a selective title, but, you know, on a non-selective title where it's about publishing, you know, all good quality research, actually having much more objective checklists. So essentially the way we do it is we have a set of checks. They're objective things that you can, you know, they're much less subjective element in there, and it makes it, you know, much harder for bias to creep into that.
With regards to the issue of guessing in blind reviews, June, I think, there was a talk in the APS ecosystem from Kim Eggleton from IOP, and she actually, I think they had an experiment where they tried this and gave the option to guess, and the numbers were kind of staggering. Something like 20% were correct. So it actually turned out to be not as easy as you know, we would have thought. And I mean, the point is that we're still guessing, right? If I get a set of reviews, then I try to figure out who they were. So that was one point I wanted to make. The other one I wanted to make is that at the moment we're presenting things as very much sort of binary. There's a lot of gray area here, and the gray area is, if we, I mean, maybe we'll touch on this, Daniel, but if we see what we think is a hint of bias, right, it's never really very clear, but these hints of bias, how do we handle those in any of these systems? I mean, those are the real tricky ones. If it's very clear, you know, the clear situations get avoided by these types of structures that we're looking at. And Rebecca, I think that's fascinating as a way to include AI in something that seems to be very, very much a human-based decision. So, I mean, I'd love to hear some more about that. But that's something that I worry about, the gray areas.
Thank you all. So the questions piling up here. We have a question from Stavroula. Oh, I'm sorry, Fotinopoulou. I'm so sorry if I'm mangling your name. Won't transparent reviews affect the objectivity of the review? There are other ways of giving credits to reviewers without revealing names, for instance, publons. Transparent reviews affecting objectivity. I mean, objectivity is kind of it's one of those words that everybody uses and thinks they know what they mean. So I don't know. I would like to hear the panel's thoughts on that, on the transparency.
Well, I think that's what I was worried about, is that, you know, if you're a junior researcher and you're about to critique a big name in the field, then certainly that's something that you need to, you know, let's be frank, you do need to think about. The flip to that is, if you write a very good review and it's received well, then it might help you. But I do think that the level of review or the type of review will change associated with those kind of policies.
So, I mean, one of the things that we do actually is we encourage reviewers to co-review. So we have actually quite a high percentage of, you know, you often invite the more senior reviewer and they in reality use one of their junior colleagues to do a lot of the work around it, and we encourage them to co-author that review. Part of it gives a little bit of protection, I think, around the more junior reviewer. Part of it gives credit, but I still think, I mean, you know, it should be, in my opinion, a discussion between the authors and reviewers. And actually, I mean, one of the interesting things I'm sure we all see, but, you know, again, it's transparent on our site, is you have reviewers with very different opinions, and it's not very clear necessarily who's actually right. There are often, you know, a lot of fields that have different opinions. I think it's valuable for people to see what those are, and as long as you can back them up, it's actually about having a constructive discussion as a community about a piece of work. And so I think that's what transparent review enables you to do. I mean, one of the things that we do, which I suspect is, well, which is different, but maybe alleviates some of these concerns, is that we do the peer review after publication. So that real sort of tension and critical decision about, do we even publish this article, has already gone, because we have a set of objective checks that decide, do we publish it or not? And then it's out there. So now it's really purely about, you know, increasing and improving the quality of the work and having that constructive discussion, where I think then, you know, as you rightly say, having, and we've had examples of this where a junior researcher has in a constructive way criticised a more senior researcher, and I've seen on Twitter later the senior researcher going, fantastic, you know, what a great review, thank you for that, was really helpful. The other point, which I think Dan mentioned earlier, you know, the way that we, you know, in some parts of the community treat critique by more junior researchers, you know, it's not right. And so I think, you know, we need to also stand up and say, we need to change some of the culture so that people aren't treated or mistreated following any kind of critique of a more senior researcher's work.
Yeah, I think, you know, the way the conversation is going is very much, you know, what do we envision? You know, what is the sort of the ethical ethos, or what is just the ethos that should be in place that we would like to see in science? And then, as Beverly had noted, there's also the realities, you know, how do things really occur currently? And so it does become at some level of philosophical discussion. I think ultimately, as I said before, I lean in favor of transparency. I mean, obviously that would mean a sort of a change in culture, as Rebecca had noted. We have to really, as a group, really push this forward. The reality of it is if we move this way tomorrow, as Beverly noted, will there be concerns from junior reviewers, so junior researchers as reviewers, and will that moderate or stifle some of the things they say? It could very well do so. But I think encouraging the openness, encouraging the communication, there are ways to do it. One way is to make a compromise, keep the reviewers' names confidential, but make the reviews themselves available, more open, to try to at least encourage the conversation without, per se, outing a junior researcher in front of someone more senior. But again, that's sort of the reality versus what we wish the environment was like.
And maybe I could come back on that last point, because my concern about that is lack of accountability. So that's where, you start to see some of this on pub peer, people saying really outrageous things because they can hide behind anonymity. So there are challenges with that too.
Absolutely.
Jumping ahead a little bit, we actually had a question about, I'm skipping one of the questions in the queue, but there was a question about what about keeping the reviewer anonymous but publishing the review. I think we partially answered or partially touched on that, but yes, I could also see how that could be very open to abuse. Of course, the editor will know presumably who the reviewer is and connecting that to the report, so that should exist as a filter. But yeah, so it certainly is something that one can dig into in terms of consequences and implications. So I think we've kind of answered that one. There is another question here, which is this is the poke Daniel Looker with a sharp stick to get a reaction. Should peer review comments not be just about the facts and truths of what is in the manuscript, and are any personal authority issues not just side matters of revealing identity that will only cause potential troubles? Yeah, I think that if I can just make a lead-in remark on that question, the peer review is a social process, so you can't really take persona, identity, authority, hierarchy, any of those things out of the process, even if you are making people anonymous. So I think that the idea that there's some sort of objective lens view from nowhere where you can just evaluate a manuscript without your own perspective, outside of your own perspective, is a pretty dangerous myth. And with that, the kind of non-inflammatory language, I was wondering if the panel had anything to add to the question about evaluating the science as divorced from the actual scientists.
Well, I don't think many people would object to the first sentence, right? I mean, I think that's what we aspire to. It's the rest of the comment that's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, at some level, when you say, can you take sort of the personality or personal opinions of the scientists sort of out of the peer review process, at some level you are selecting a reviewer to give a perspective, and of course it's going to reflect on their own thoughts about what underlies the field and what's the appropriate direction. It's sort of hard to articulate, but no matter what, you're right in the sense that you cannot get that thread of just this is my belief, and so I look at the facts in a certain perspective. It's really hard to separate sort of that individual thoughts from just looking at it as Rebecca might say, like an AI system, and just look at the objective nature of something sort of without opinion on top of it. I think it's the editor's duty to understand those subtleties and to sort of see through the sort of the opinion aspects and really focus in on what facts are coming out.
Yeah, and I should be clear, I guess I'm not suggesting that all the peer review is AI oriented, because it couldn't be. I can't see how you could. I guess I'm thinking more in terms of, some of the assessments you might do at desk reject stage, for example. There are elements, and many already include tools to support some of that. And around, one of the things we do and provide to authors and use ourselves as well is AI, as many do, AI-based tools to suggest reviewers. And we've often explored the idea of, should one of the reviewers be suggested by AI, just so that there's some complete independence away from humans about the person that was suggested around it. There are many challenges around it, which is why we haven't done that yet. But it's something that I think is an interesting concept to explore.
We have actually got several questions in the queue about AI and algorithms. And of course, as we all realize, algorithms are written by people who have their own biases and their own preconceptions that they come into work. There's been plenty of work on that. So I think it's important not to think of AI as some sort of silver bullet. So what kind of discussions have there been around adopting AI? I'd like to not run. I didn't introduce myself. I'm an editor for physical review letters, and I would like to stop running the same referee search over and over again on a narrow range of manuscripts. But at the same time, I'm wondering if the AI is necessarily going to stop. Is that going to do a better job in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equity, in terms of getting a broader range of perspectives involved in the process, or is it just going to recapitulate the biases of whoever wrote the algorithm?
I think it also goes beyond who wrote the algorithm, right? A lot of these algorithms are learning-based, based systems, and so they actually maintain sometimes the bias that's inherited in the database it's searching on. So if you have a historic bias, say, your referees are 3/4 male, 1/4 female, right? As these systems learn through it, there's more chance that they'll maintain that sort of gender bias, for instance, in reviewers. You have to be very cautious in that software to try to understand where the inherent bias is and how do you break those in something that's strictly learning from what is already a biased data set.
That's great. Maybe we could move on to another question. We've had a few. Nobody's raising their hand, but we have questions coming in the chat as well as in the Q&A. So trying just to sort this out a little bit. There is a specific question for Rebecca here, which I think I would like to jump to. I'm reading it out here for Rebecca. It does not seem as clear cut to me. For example, what happens when a referee is from a developing country versus a rich university author? I think that we're talking, the question is about openness, about transparent review, and about hierarchy. I'm kind of touched on this, I guess, but do you have anything, Rebecca, if you had anything more to add at this point?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the same, or a very similar issue to the sort of junior researchers. It's a different thing, but it's so we, as many publishers do, encourage to make sure that we've got a diversity of where reviewers come from around a particular manuscript. But again, I would kind of reiterate here that even in this scenario, there is an issue if you have it completely transparent, and if you as a researcher, as a reviewer, are overly critical, or indeed the opposite, overly positive about something and are clearly missing some flaws in the manuscript, it actually doesn't do you any good as a because it's all out there in public. And so I think there is something about having it all open actually restricts people from being overly one way or the other. And so I think a lot of as I say, transparency isn't perfect, but I think my sense is that on balance, there are more significant benefits of having that transparency out there, getting people to be accountable for what they write and how they say it, and for everybody to be able to see whether there looks to be bias in there or not, and not just one individual behind closed doors.
So we have a request for an overview of the issue here. If that's transparency mean publishing reviews itself, it does it just mean revealing the identity of the reviewer? I'm prepared to answer this, because I set up the panel discussion and made these people talk about what I wanted to talk about. That when I decided to contrast transparency and confidentiality, there's a huge scale of transparency approaches and huge scale of confidentiality approaches. We've touched on making authors, referees, or even editors well, you don't make the editor anonymous. I don't think you really gain anything by that, but hiding the identity of the authors and from the editor is certainly an approach that could be done. And there are variations on this theme. So what we're talking about here are, just to clarify, is a number of different approaches that can fit into fairly big bins called transparency and confidentiality. So I think that hopefully clarifies things. So we have another question about, I think about open review in the sense of, does it not just lead to more direct conflicts between scientists? And I think that's perhaps something that are people going to continue to be collegial when they know who they're talking to? I mean, there's an argument that, as opposed to the current situation where everything, authors and referees always agree and treat each other with respect, but would there be more conflict with a more transparent review system? I think is a way to phrase that question.
I would say, speaking from experience, we haven't seen that, and we've been doing quite a number of years now, and we've seen. I mean, obviously, there are some people who don't care and will write something inappropriate externally. We do. I mean, I should be clear. We do moderate stuff before it goes out. So and we do reiterate an awful lot of times before it goes out. Remember, this is public, right? And the vast majority of people will write it in a constructive way. There are some people that don't care, but I think it's a small minority. So the discussions that we've seen have all been, generally respectful. What it does allow is that conversation of, oh, I see what you mean, or reviewer, I think you've missed the point. Actually, what I meant is this, and that debate and discussion between you, which you also get at conferences, right? I mean, it's kind of moving that discussion and debate online, and also so others can get to see the differing opinions and that debate, which I think is so important. But as I say, from our experience so far, it's by and large very constructive between the different participants.
Yeah, and I think, as I can see in some of them, they're talking about some of the legal issues. There are cases where parties have launched lawsuits, whether it's against a journal to try to determine who were the anonymous reviewers, because it led to, whether, messed up a patent application or whatever, or they're just litigious in nature. Which I think there are some people out there. The real question is though you may strip away some protections, these are really a minority of what goes on. We see hundreds of thousands, millions of papers published annually. And, these instances where I think there's a significant amount of friction that could go into sort of legal ramifications are just, it's easy to count them on one hand. So I think, again, trying to figure out a policy or a stance based on a very small exception, though concerning, but still an exception, is probably not the way to go. It's really how to best serve the greater community. What is the best way of ensuring that peer review becomes, retains the trust, incites conversation and discussion, and leads to what ends up being a very transparent process. And however we manage to do that, whether through confidentiality, anonymity, or true openness in the peer review process, is exactly what we're debating here. But ultimately, it is to try to maintain trust, confidence in the system, and then ultimately sort of the transparency of decisions made for publications.
Can I add something, going back perhaps to the previous question as well, this idea of the tension between transparency and confidentiality. As an editor, I've been genuinely surprised in the last 6 months, whatever I've been co-lead editor for, with the guesses at nefarious processes that people have in the absence of information. And so transparency to some degree is just making sure that people know how we do things and how biases cannot creep in or could, or really on the flip to that is where they could come in. So some of this is just telling people how we do things and what the expectation is for our community.
I think it's time for another poll. So about your decisions about where you choose to publish, to what extent do the editorial policies with regards to transparency and confidentiality affect that? I'll be interested to see what people are saying. Just because I'm a bit of a newcomer at this, are people seeing the results as they're accumulated, or that's okay? So interesting. So this is just a show for my benefit then.
Well, the commentary is exciting, so you can tell us who's ahead.
Okay, I'll try to make some sort of. Right now it seems that to put it mildly, editorial policies with regards to transparency and confidentiality does not seem to be a very important consideration. I'm surprised to see that only one person wants to find out who the referees are. I don't believe that is the case. I think that we're all very curious and prurient people and love gossip and would love to know who's reviewed our papers. When I started working with the American Physical Society, I discovered to my chagrin that the organization had blocked me from seeing who reviewed old papers that I had submitted. And so I will never know who was a referee on that paper. I mean, I'll get over it eventually, but I do think it seems that people are curious about both seeing reports as a reader, and they're curious about author anonymity alongside referee anonymity. But I think that it would be fair to say, with this about 2/3 have weighed in, that maybe this is not the most important consideration. We can have people answer the poll for a little bit longer, but we can move on to another question. I think maybe I shouldn't be ignoring our friends in the chat who are keeping a sort of discussion going here. I'm seeing if we can transform some of this chat into an actual question. There's a question about reinforcing power structures does transparency encourage or does it discourage diversity? And I think that that is certainly something which I don't have a clear-cut answer to. I can see how it works in different ways, and I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts about this. The full chat question that I'm looking at is, I guess you can all see it, but the one I'm pointing at is one from Freya Nielsen. Would transparency not discourage diversity and enforce existing power structures in society? However, there have been studies suggesting that authors from low-income countries prefer confidentiality, by which I think that she means anonymous authorship to try to get in the way of bias by reviewers. I think that touches on a little bit of what we were talking about earlier with whether or not anonymity should be compulsory if applied. I think that I mean, there is there are known effects that the people who will benefit from having their names revealed will choose to have their names revealed, and the people who won't benefit from it will choose not to have their names revealed. So
maybe I could also chip in.
Oh, please do.
So I was going to say, so we work with the African Academy of Sciences with a platform dedicated to the community in Africa. And one of the reasons why they were so keen to work with us and to have full transparency is because they wanted to be treated equally. That was kind of that was kind of their core reason for doing it, because they wanted to, what happens behind closed doors is, quite often, and we even had examples of people who used to be based in Oxford and would say, I have no problem getting published in the top journals, move to Kenya, I'm the same person. Now people look at the affiliation and now I have a real problem in publishing. So part of this again might be about our model because we publish first, but it's about removing the barriers and hurdles to getting their research out there and being treated on a level playing field. And then when you've got transparent peer review, to my point earlier, regardless of who the reviewers are that then review it, because it's transparent, people feel they need to sort of behave a little better, shall I say, and make sure they're being constructive, make sure they're being fair, because everybody can see how you're behaving and how your peer review is in the context of the research that's being presented. So that was the explicit reason why they wanted that full transparency, is to level the playing field with the rest of the world.
I guess there's also something about representation, in the sense that if you are showing that you're breaking the presumption that your author will always be from a Western prosperous institution, and that it's actually, the playing field is much more diverse than people give it credit for, that is something that could do its bit in promoting diversity on its in that sense. So I'm sharing the poll results, which I think is, the poor showing for the public interest in this particular panel, but perhaps giving the fourth option as a sort of get out was not a smart way of designing this poll, but I thought we hopefully would learn something. I have a very quick question, and probably it's directed to Rebecca, being when reports become public, when they become published, who owns the copyright of the report? The journal?
So the way we do it is, all of our publications are CC BY license, so that means they're fully open access, and the copyright stays with whoever previously was a copyright holder, and the same is true for the reviewers. And obviously, in that case, it's the reviewers are the copyright holder, and it stays with them. So we ensure that it is fully open access. Things need attributing, and actually we allow and encourage people to be able to cite the review reports independently of the article. And in fact, we have examples where people have done that. That isn't just the reviewer citing their own review report, because actually, if you think about it, review reports are often quite interesting. Sort of context around the area, and can be quite valuable in themselves to cite. But yeah, we leave the copyright with the authors.
That was the original idea when they started consulting independent reviewers for the proceedings of the Royal Society, was the idea that they would provide a sort of useful commentary on the side of the articles, which themselves might be illegible, but that sort of morphed into a different form of review that was critical rather than laudatory. And that's also when anonymity, at least that's one path towards the inclusion of anonymity in the process of reviewing papers, because once the report started becoming critical, the question of consequences for the poor reviewer became a much more live issue. Since I hate to put Rebecca on the spot again, but I have another question about AI algorithm picking referees. So do you have a percentage about how many people, what fraction of the reviewers are chosen by AI?
I'm not sure I can give you a specific percentage. Maybe I should explain, because I think there's probably a bit of confusion about what I'm sort of saying is what we do. So our model, so the article goes through this sort of objective set of checks, and then we publish it. It's an author-driven model. So we provide the authors with tools to help them suggest reviewers. They can use the AI-based tool, they can ignore it, they can suggest some other people, but then we come in and then we look at those suggestions. So we will check that they are indeed experts in the relevant fields. We'll check for obvious conflicts of interest, etc. And we may suggest some other reviewers as well as part of that. So I don't want to give the impression that it's all kind of AI based and those are the only reviewers that get invited, because that absolutely is not the case. I think it very much also depends on the discipline. It depends on the community and how well they know the community anyway, and just know the sort of people who they think are the sort of the relevant experts or not. It varies quite considerably, I'd say, across disciplines and communities, so regionally as well, and career stages, obviously.
Yeah, just step out of my COPE role for a moment and sort of go back to my ACS role. We're rolling out sort of a reviewer recommender AI software for our editors in that case, since, unlike F1000, right, it's a sort of the peer review process to determine the publishability of an article. So this is to help support the editors at selecting a broad range of reviewers. The advantage to a recommender, and again, it's a recommender, not an absolute, as Rebecca noted, is that for ACS, within the system themselves, right, the editors can frame searches of referees that have reviewed for their journals, or they can use their own personal experience at pulling experts. The particular AI tool that's going out from ACS actually is able to then select and check the entire portfolio of ACS journals and look across all of them for potential reviewers. So it does give some advantage to try to spread out, sort of create greater diversity, but it's always an optional case. It's not set up to be the end all and be all.
So this is a bit more like the sort of the trained judgment, the mechanically, procedurally enabled thing, but then you add a filter of the trained judgment from the operator, rather than just handing over all the judgment to the machine and saying this is the mechanical objectivity. You add that filter. That's how I see it. That I would find useful as an editor. Putting on my editor hat for a moment there. I'd like suggestions, but I don't want to be strong-armed into using the suggestions automatically, and I don't think that's necessarily going to lead to the best outcome either.
I think we still have to focus on the database, as was raised earlier, right? I mean, the true diversification comes from getting new people into the ecosystem who may have struggled to get into the ecosystem. So, but that's what we should be doing with or without AI, I guess. So.
Yes, I mean, there's a point been made by the philosopher of science, Helen Long, that peer review doesn't just begin and end with the submission of a manuscript to a journal, but it's about like what projects get funded, who gets to be a graduate student, who gets to get the education to go to graduate school in the first place, and the reception of the work after publication. Where does some work wind up being presented, not presented? So if one takes a much broader view of what constitutes peer review, then yes, very much pushing the buttons inside of the narrow window being under the charge of a journal may not, that's probably not going to solve any number of problems. We have some questions coming in. Actually, one question, it isn't really a question, but rather a statement about reinforcing power structures under open reviews, and that's sort of, well, we sort of covered that. I think I like a statement that values the role of the editor in thinking carefully about the reviews that they receive. As an editor, I always like to be appreciated for what I do. But if anybody has anything to add to that. But here's another question, which is again about the transparent and open review, I guess, which is it harder to find reviewers to participate when they know that their reviews will be published and their identity might be revealed and so on and so forth?
Shall I jump in? I mean, it's interesting because when we first launched F1000 Research back in 2013, that's exactly what we expected to find. I think, I mean, at that point, I would say probably it was harder because open peer review, I mean, there were certainly, you know, quite a number of journals, particularly in medicine, that were doing elements of open peer review, different levels of open peer review, but generally it wasn't so common. I think the landscape has changed quite considerably. We did do analysis a couple of years ago, looking at our acceptance rates and comparing them with where we had staff that come from other publishers, comparing those numbers. And actually, it's now, from our perspective, no different really. And I think part of it, it sometimes takes reviewers longer to do it because they think more carefully about it and because they know everybody's going to read what they've said. But I think part of it comes down to the credit. You know, they actually get some visibility and credit for having spent all that time, which is, you know, often considerable time, really reviewing and reviewing properly. And I think that often balances out the sort of nervousness of reviewing more publicly. Obviously, it differs in different disciplines, but I think a number of disciplines have also just, you know, it's more common that you see this, and so become more familiar. We've had many reviewers sort of say, I've never done it before, but actually I really enjoyed it, and I think I'll do it again now. So it's about people sort of getting used to it, having experienced it once, and then realizing some of the positive benefits from having done that.
I'm jumping into the chat. I see a question about what to do next. This is a gloriously open-ended question, but those are sometimes the most fun. So maybe at this, as we're coming up to the hour mark, it'd be interesting if I could have everybody, your panelists' perspective, each of you, on where you see peer review going in the next 5-10 years or so. What trends are you thinking will get stronger? I mean, we live in a changing world with increasing amounts of social media, and the new generation that had grown up with a completely different idea of how to express themselves as a public person, particularly online. Just throwing some seeds out there, but where do you see things going, basically? Anyone can jump in.
I think, I think the scientific endeavor, or publishing in general, is a pretty, let's see, it's like a super tanker on the ocean. It's very slow when you want to change directions. It's not very agile. So when you're talking about what might be seen in the next 4 or 5 years, my initial reaction is globally, not much. I think the single mass peer review will probably still remain the dominant form. However, I think there is, or seems to be, a general trend toward more open peer review. And so what might we see in the decades to come? We may see a transition. I know more and more publishers are experimenting with it. I know ACS is looking for ways of experimenting with other forms of peer review. So, you know, different levels of blindness. So I think there's a general nature for publishers to explore and experiment. So I think we might eventually see a drift away, but excuse me, I think it'd be a long time coming.
I'll jump in because I'm going to be brief. I'm not sure I have a whole lot to say from my role in the APS, except that I think the question about what is the goal of the discussion is a super important one. So education of what are the things that work, where the issues come, and that they're real. And so there was a question in the chat about, is bias increasing? There would be stats, there are stats to answer that question, but I think whether it's increasing or not, it exists. And so making sure that we're aware of the places that they can come in for everybody. Everyone has implicit biases of one kind or another. And so making sure that whatever we do is to improve that situation, to make access to science more equitable. And then really trying to, I raised this point before, trying to deal with the gray areas, because we all hope for those really clear-cut decisions where it's obvious. There was a question earlier about, what if it's a mean or poor review? Well, those ones are simple, right? It's the ones where it's a little needle and you don't know why that's in the review, or there's some ulterior motive, right? Positioning going on in the background. I mean, those are the ones that are harder to handle, and finding levers to adjust the way we handle the review process based on those are things that I think are very important. And part of this, as I said, is education. So I think this idea of encouraging co-reviewing is so important, setting the standards by which we would like to not setting them in stone. Your point is well taken, Daniel, that these things evolve and the way that people are presenting their scientific opinion is changing, but at least setting the goals for review, I think, is important.
Yes, I mean, I agree about the goal, but maybe I come back to that. I mean, I guess my sense is, as I mentioned earlier, we started in medicine and life sciences, and watching the trajectory and speed of the trajectory actually since 2013, which isn't so long ago, has actually been relatively fast. I think different disciplines will go at different speeds. So I would expect to see significantly more transparency in other fields, like in physics and physical sciences generally, and increasingly in some areas of humanities and social sciences. There are some areas, no question, that are controversial areas, for example, where there are real challenges and really need thinking very carefully about full transparency and how that works. But I do think definitely the trajectory is towards more transparency at a reasonable speed. But no, I agree, it's not going to completely shift overnight, that's for sure. I think, having, to the point, Beverly, you just made about sort of those grey areas and spotting little needles, I completely agree with you, but I guess that's where I would argue having more eyes on it, not just a single editor trying to figure it out, but having the whole world looking at it, you're more likely to spot those things. And we see that with, retractions and things that happen after, when somebody goes, hang on a minute, just spotted this. So I would say more transparency will help that. And my final point, going back to the goal point, I think we're increasingly across the world seeing a real challenge in trust in science, and I think and trust in the process that goes behind it. And so that's why I think having transparency allows people to see, why was this article accepted, and who were the people who thought it was good, or indeed, people can reject things essentially, or not necessarily reject, but kind of say, I don't think this is very good on the platform, and being able to see why, or see those differing views. And I think it's really important to provide credibility in the scientific process, and also for the public themselves to be able to see the differing views, which also help to explain why we might flip-flop or appear to flip-flop our views about certain things in science. And it's not just that we can't make our mind up, it's that there are genuinely different views about this that are all relevant, and we don't know the answer in many cases to which is the right answer, and it's good to get those elements aired to support that trust.
That's a very good way of thinking about it. So I would just like to see if the needle has moved during this session. So I'm hitting you with another poll, which may look staggeringly familiar to you. But I'd like to thank our panelists. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I don't know if we've solved the problem or we've come to a clear distinction about or even if we know where things are going to end up. But it's been a really educational discussion, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of the questions in the chat and everything. But yes, it's thank you everybody for tuning in and for participating. And I don't remember quite where we were in this is only viewable to me, but it seems that we're moving towards more of a 50-50 situation with between confidentiality and transparency, and perhaps that's I think that means that the transparency may have gained some ground here. So, well, for those who argued for transparency, I guess that is a victory. I'm going to reveal the poll at this point. Here we go. Yes, so I cut it off a little bit early, maybe, but yeah, I mean, this is not a very rigorous study, but I think that it's interesting to see that things are kind of fluid. And so again, thank you so much, everybody, for your participation, and enjoy the rest of peer review week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Thank
everyone.
You, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Thanks. I learned a lot.
Yeah, I'm going to end this now.